it was 2 weeks ago, my therapist asked me, can you share with me some examples of your family where they showed signs or examples of self-love? And I proudly sat there for like 30 seconds trying to think of examples, and I could not come up with anything. And that's when I kind of realized I didn't really grow up with examples of how to love myself. Redefining self-development through the lens of a first-gen Latina. Welcome to Tell Me Más. Hi, welcome to Tell Me Más, a podcast all about wellness, mental health, finances, business, you name it, all from the perspective of a first-gen Latina. And this is officially our first episode, and I am so excited to finally get this podcast started. I officially wanted to get this started last summer, but that just wasn't able to happen. I was going through some mental health issues, so now we're back and I'm feeling a lot better and at ease to finally get this thing going. It's something that I've been super passionate about, is just talking about mental health, especially in the Latino community, just because we don't talk about it enough. And a lot of the podcasts that are out there right now, they're more focused on the white non-immigrant experience, and I think our voices should be heard too. But again, thank you so much for coming and listening. Oh, and I should probably introduce myself. Me llamo Dina. I am the host of Tell Me Más, but you can also find me on TikTok and Instagram as Dinapreneur, a space where I just talk about my experience with mental health, wellness, starting a business. We'll get to all that, but again, thanks so much for joining. And you can find this episode and all episodes of Tell Me Más on YouTube and Spotify. Both the audio recording and the video will be up on YouTube. But yeah, let's get into it. So today we're going to be talking about self-love and kind of growing up without that sort of lesson of self-love. And what prompted me to want to talk about this specific topic is that I think it was 2 weeks ago, my therapist asked me, can you share with me some examples of your family where they showed signs or examples of self-love? And I proudly sat there for like 30 seconds trying to think of examples, and I could not come up with anything. And that's when I kind of realized I didn't really grow up with examples of how to love myself, aside from, spending money on yourself or buying yourself the occasional nice thing. But beside from that, I just did not grow up with any of those lessons. And it got me wondering, was I the only one? Is this a Latino or a first or an immigrant family thing? So I think it's just an interesting conversation, and it kind of made me want to really talk about how it's really never too late to learn how to love yourself and how to do it properly, because we all see self-love differently. It comes to us differently. So however you or however I may define it might be different, but just knowing that it's never too late to start learning how to love yourself, that's what matters. Like I was saying, self-love, the definition of self-love looks different for everyone. For me, I kind of define it as being able to put yourself first without feeling guilty, being able to work hard towards something but feeling like you deserve the success and the awards that comes with it. Or it means being able to set up boundaries. Boundaries are so important in being able to be comfortable in saying that you love yourself. And that's my own definition of it. Again, your definition might be different. I think finding a definition that works for you is really important. And knowing that you deserve to love yourself. It's never too late. And it might feel uncomfortable at first, because it did for me, but again, it's not too late to start that process. But let's kind of get into this conversation of what self-love looks like in the Latina immigrant family perspective. Like I said, growing up, I didn't have many examples in my family of self-love. Just, from like going shopping and buying yourself nice things, I didn't really see it beyond that. I think like a lot of Latino or immigrant families, it's all about, putting your family first, staying humble, and not thinking that you're better than anyone else, that sacrificing your own being and your own time is for the betterment of the family was seen as better than, putting yourself first. It was almost like saying that you love yourself or setting these boundaries was seen as selfish. Ya no nos quieres, no te importamos, or ya te crees, stuff like that, instead of, it being seen as like a power move. That's why when my therapist asked me, how did your family show signs of self-love, I just could not come up with anything. And I don't blame them because, again, they probably didn't grow up with any lessons or examples from their own family either. So it's kind of this generational cycle of like, if you don't grow up with an example of how to love yourself, how will you learn to love yourself outside from seeking it from other people or other sources? And this is my own experience of growing up first gen in a Mexican American household. This might not be your experience, but I feel like this is a very common sentiment in a lot of Latino or immigrant households, whereas we come from a very collective community, a lot of prioritizing our family versus ourselves, especially even if that means that we're essentially out of energy. You're still expected to show up even when you're at your worst without knowing how to properly build these boundaries and see people in your family establishing these boundaries or saying, no, I can't come over today because I feel not up for it today, regardless of if they feel sick or not. You kind of learn that it's almost an expectation to show up regardless of how you're feeling. But let me just reiterate, like, loving yourself should not be seen as selfish. Loving yourself does not mean that you are creída or that you don't care about your family. Loving yourself does not mean that you aren't humble. It simply means that you care about yourself, you love yourself, and that in order to fill other people's cups, you have to fill yours first. You have to love yourself in order to better take care of others. And it's okay to say no. It's okay to say no. I know it's hard. And setting up those boundaries really, really takes time, especially if you grew up without seeing examples of it. Once you start doing it once you start doing it twice, you see that it starts to get a little bit easier and the guilt slowly starts to fade away. And that was my experience. So how did growing up without lessons of self-love in my family impact me? Great question, Dina. I know, thanks. But I think it really impacted the way I saw myself. Obviously, I didn't know how to make boundaries, not just with my family, but with friends or significant others. I would feel extremely, extremely guilty when I would have to say no to my family. I didn't realize I was self-sabotaging a lot and believing that I wasn't deserving of many, many things. I didn't really see my family develop healthy boundaries with each other, and whenever, a seemingly confident woman passed by, they would be like, oh, se ve bien creída, etc., etc. And I even grew up with, sometimes my family saying not just mean things to each other, but to themselves. And that really sticks with you. And you kind of I kind of started to develop this negative self-talk where I would often put myself down for not doing really, really well on one thing, or comparing myself to others, or like, why can't I be confident like her, or believing that maybe they are creída because they show up with a certain air of confidence. And it's insane to think that these patterns start to show up in your own head. But I think it's really, really important that you start realizing them and just kind of see it as a thought. It doesn't define you. It doesn't mean that you truly believe that, but it's important to notice it and kind of be like, oh, that's interesting that I thought that. And I think that's really the key towards starting to notice the negative self-talk and move towards a nicer, loving, more caring kind of talk to yourself. And another way it really shows up is kind of thinking that I don't deserve certain things, not just career-wise, but sort of like when I buy myself nice things or go on vacation, I almost feel like, oh, I feel like I'm not working enough, I don't deserve it, or you start to feel kind of this sense of guilt because, your family works hard and they're not able to enjoy this privilege that you have of traveling. And I think that's a sentiment that a lot of first gen adults experience right now, especially as they start to travel and start to move towards careers that are seen more privileged than that of their family or parents. In my experience, I would feel extremely guilty for complaining, and that I'd be like, oh, I need to stop feeling so terrible about this situation. And then again, it would feel like I didn't deserve it. That's not the case. You shouldn't feel like you have to deserve something in order to enjoy it. And that's, I think, my biggest problem right now that I'm currently still working on. And like I mentioned earlier in my definition of self-love, being able to set boundaries and not feel guilty about them, number one for me. Again, because I didn't see this healthy boundary setting in my family, I didn't know how to do it. I would say no to something or decline something, and I'd feel terrible and guilty about it. But once as I started to see it as more of like a form of self-love and not seeing it as something that's going to go super wrong if I didn't say yes, it started to get a lot easier, and I feel a lot less guilty, especially saying no to my family. And if they feel some sort of way about it, I can't control that. And knowing that you can't control your family's emotions, that takes such a big weight off of your shoulders. Because again, it doesn't mean that you don't love them, that you don't appreciate them. You just want to do something else, and that's okay. But okay, let's summarize. How do we get into this mindset of self-love? How do we break these generational traumas and curses of not showing self-love to ourselves? It really starts just by practice, setting up those boundaries. Number one, not feeling guilty about them. Number two, noticing that negative self-talk and not judging it. Know that everyone has these thoughts. It's normal. But once that thought comes up, either think about it, process it, or kind of jot it down and come back to it later. It really all comes down to noticing it, because your thoughts do not define you. And lastly, figure out how to replace that negative self-talk. If you often find yourself saying, oh, I hate the way my hair looks, place that thought, or I love the way my hair looks in this specific hairstyle. Kind of change it up a little bit, you know? It's normal. It's normal not to love yourself some days, and it's normal to love the crap out of yourself some days. I think also aiming for this sort of neutrality, super, super important. Because once you start setting boundaries, it's going to inspire your family to set boundaries too. And that's awesome. Because then they're kind of learning from you, low key. And I think you can kind of set that ball in motion, and you never know where it can go. Learning to show yourself some love doesn't come easily. It doesn't happen overnight. I feel like loving yourself is a lifelong journey. And honestly, it's only going to get better each and every day. I'm a firm believer that if you work on it every day by 1%, it's going to accumulate, and then all of a sudden you're going to be like, holy crap, I was in such a different mindset last year than I am today. So just a little bit every single day, it'll amaze you. But once you start to really work on this journey, there are some common challenges that might come up, especially if you relate to me and didn't grow up with examples or guidance on self-love. You will see that you might have trouble setting boundaries. I often feel undeserving of good things. You also might feel uncomfortable with being confident or wanting to be confident, especially if your family often sees confident people as selfish or creído or creída. So it might make it really, really hard for you to explore that side of yourself. And it's not easy. Really is just taking it day by day, and slowly it's just going to become second nature. And again, you never know. Once you start to do it, maybe they'll be like, well, she or he is not creída, but they clearly love themselves, then maybe they're onto something. So you might just inspire others to think the way that you're thinking. And especially growing up with family that was always family first, or be humble. Being humble and putting your family first sometimes is important, but not loving yourself or accepting yourself can leave some really, really bad consequences. I know the reason that I probably developed anxiety and depression is because I didn't value myself. And I think a lot of the goals that I had for myself, I have not been able to reach because I have felt so undeserving of them. So that's why it's so, so important to really value yourself and see yourself in this light that you are the bad bitch that you are. Because if you don't see yourself that way, how are you going to expect to really get to the places that you want to go? And it begs this question of, like, am I the version that I want to live with for the rest of my life? Am I the version that wants to hate myself or see myself, tell myself all these negative things constantly? And I think another good way to see it is, if you want to, or if you had your own family, would you want to tell them not to love themselves or not to put themselves first sometimes? That's just another perspective of the really long-term consequences that not giving yourself some love can have on your life. And lastly, you can really develop these unhealthy relationships with yourself and others. I know I did when I really, really didn't value myself. It got me into some really bad situations that I feel like I would have said no to if I had prioritized and really truly loved myself. Reverse side of that, I maybe would have had said yes to a lot of different opportunities that would have put me in some amazing experiences if I had believed in myself and had loved myself and valued myself enough to say yes to those things. So let's get into some affirmations of self-love, shall we? Yo soy chingona. Yo soy chingona. And feel free to repeat these in your head or out loud. I deserve good and amazing things. I deserve good and amazing things. I am worthy. I am worthy. Estoy orgullosa de mí misma. O mismo. Estoy orgullosa de mí misma o mismo. Just repeat affirmations like these every so often. I'm not saying like it has to be a morning thing, a part of your morning routine, because I know this is just another habit to set, but every time you run into these types of affirmations, really just take them in and really start believing in those words, because you really are deserving of amazing things and so, so much more. I promise you. And aside from affirmations, let's go over some other strategies and tips that you might be able to take up on to really start fostering that self-love and start showing your family that it's not creído or creída to love yourself, that eres chingona, and that you still love your family at the same time, because it's possible. But my first tip here is to really do some self-reflection, do some journaling prompts. One of the journaling prompts that helped me was thinking of those examples that I might have seen of self-love in my family, whether it's just your family buying physical items. And if you can't come up with anything, ask yourself why, or what were they doing instead? Like, how is self-love seen in your family? Another good reflection exercise would be coming up with reasons that you love yourself. They can be appearance-wise, they can be personality-wise. If you have big boobs and you love them, write that down. If you love your smile, if you love that you're left-handed, write that down. If you love the way that you love your family, write that down. Hype yourself up, because it is chingona. You're that bitch, girl. And yes, I do cuss on this podcast. I'm sorry. It's part of my personality. And number two, this might be easier said than done, but of course, seeking therapy. I'm a big proponent of Latinas and Latinos seeking therapy or finding that professional guidance. Sometimes even a life coach might be accessible. You're already going to therapy or that's not accessible to you. Build a support system and engage in self-care practices. Think of people that really display that message of self-love. Maybe it's a colleague, a friend, a neighbor, someone that you watch on YouTube, and really take inspiration from them. And notice what they talk about, what they carry, or how they carry themselves, and maybe have these conversations with them of how did you get to this place of confidence, and just making these conversations more accessible, more easy, less, what's the word? I can't think of the word. Less taboo. That's the word. Because I think we can all care for one another, but also still love the frick out of ourselves at the same time. And I guess if I want to incorporate a daily habit, there's a lot of 5-minute meditations on YouTube that you can do, maybe just starting off once a week or 3 times a week. I know it's really hard to tell someone to do it every day because I don't do it every day. I really want to, but it just feels really nice after doing it once. You're like, I should really do this every day, but there's a lot of those. And I have an amazing book recommendation that actually my therapist recommended. It's called The Body Is Not an Apology, The Power of Radical Self-Love. I'm like halfway through the book, but there's been a lot of mind-blowingness. And it's really focused on body neutrality. And it's by the author Sonia Renee Taylor. Amazing book. I'm actually listening to the audiobook, which is probably why it's taking me a little bit longer. I thought I'd be better at audiobooks, but I digress. The Body Is Not an Apology, The Power of Radical Self-Love by Sonia Renee Taylor. Amazing book. Highly recommend, even though I'm only halfway in, but it's been super helpful thus far. And I just want to end with a reminder that healing and this journey of self-love is not linear. Cada día va a ser diferente. Some days you're really gonna feel like the baddest bitch alive. Otros días te vas a sentir como caca. And that's normal. Healing is not linear. 1%, like I was saying, 1% each day accumulates in the long run. And everyone starts somewhere. And that's with anything. I did not love myself as much as I do. So it's amazing to see the progress in my mindset and the way I uphold myself this year versus last year. It is possible. No te vas a sentir creída, or no vas a ser creída if you don't want to be. You're not going to be selfish for loving yourself. You are not going to be a bad person for loving yourself. You're not going to be a mean person for saying no and putting yourself first. Because self-love is important, and valuing yourself is a whole different kind of power that I can't even fathom right now. Yeah, this was the first episode of Tell Me Más, and I like to do summaries at the end. So we talked about, growing up without examples of self-love in our familia, and how this can really impact us in the long run, and how really starting to noticing these unkind behaviors towards ourselves can affect our future, and how once we start working on this whole self-love, it can really inspire others to do the same. And then we talk about some tips and tricks on how to really be kinder to ourselves, whether it's through journaling, watching videos, reading books. Again, reiterating that this isn't a linear process. Some days are going to look different, or all days are going to look different, and it's about the journey. And I firmly believe that you can always love yourself a little bit more each and every day. But yeah, that's the end of today's that is the end of today's episode. I really hope you found this helpful, and that this sparks some inspiration to really be kind to yourself today, and to say no if you don't want to do something, porque You don't gotta say yes all the time. And yeah, I hope this kind of gives you some insight into what Tell Me Más is going to be about. It's really going to be talking about these big mindset, mental health conversations through the lens of a first-gen Latina. So if you resonate, give the Spotify a follow, subscribe to the YouTube channel. I would really, really appreciate it, and I just can't wait to see where we can get this community to. And of course, if you have any ideas for future episodes, feel free to comment them or message me on TikTok or Instagram, and you can find me at Dinapreneur. And yeah, I hope you have an amazing and beautiful day. Remember to love yourself each and every single moment of life when you can. If you hate yourself some days, shit happens, but at the end of the day, just tell yourself that you're amazing regardless. Los quiero. Los veo en la próxima. Bye.